Welcome to the Battery Testing Mentor podcast. My name is Johannes and here I discuss all topics around battery testing and battery handling. Short, on the point and with practical advice. Also visit www.batterytestingmentor.com and register there for the email update. With every episode I send out an email with the takeaways of that episode. And if you have any questions, comments, advice, or wishes for topics, just hit reply on that email and you directly reach me. With that, enough of the housekeeping, let's get into the episode. Today I want to jump a little bit in topics. I discussed in the second episode how a battery can pose risks. In the third episode I discussed how a cell works. Today I want to talk about how to handle a battery safely. Why this jump? First, I said that this podcast is about battery handling and battery testing, so I should also talk about battery handling. On the other hand, I think that by moving batteries around is probably the first contact point for most of the people that they have with batteries. So it's definitely worth to explore a little bit in more detail. And very easy speaking, how to handle a battery well is take care, handle it with care. As the stickers on the cases say, handle it with care. I also want to reference this one time, second episode where I said I was once recommended handle a battery like it is a baby, like a human baby. Be careful. Don't do anything crazy with it. But today I want to go a little bit more into detail and start with how to store batteries. What I tell you now is applicable for cells, for modules, for packs. There are some differences in the details, but overall it's applicable for all levels. And then let's say, what is the temperature like? You should not store it too hot. It's pretty easy. You shouldn't store it too cold. Also easy. But how does it look in the details? I mean, the easiest way is to look in the spec sheet of the battery, and there it should be normally mentioned what is the storage temperature. If you store the battery too warm, it will discharge faster, it will age faster. So discharge is more like the short-term phenomenon because the chemistry is just more active inside. So self-discharge happens, like any lithium-ion battery has a certain self-discharge. If you store it for a long time, at one point it will be completely dead. Of course, it's not something that happens within a day or two or weeks. It's really a longer phenomenon, but with higher temperature, it will be faster. Also, the aging will be faster because you have this higher activity inside the cell, and thermal aging, just that higher temperature, is really significantly faster than kind of aging at lower temperature. So if we go then to the lower temperature, there you should also not store it too cold. There is no direct impact. I mean, if we say about kind of normal temperatures, you will have a lower activity inside the cell. The chemistry is kind of in sleep mode, which can be kind of good, because it ages then also a little bit lower, especially if you don't use it. An aspect on battery pack level is that if you have a cooling system inside and you have then leftovers of the cooling fluid, or maybe just water because you washed the cooling circuit out, and you go really to lower temperatures, this might freeze and then really cause some mechanical damage inside the battery pack. I mean, the question is always like, what temperature is really the boundary? This depends on the system, on the cell, on the cooling circuit. But just considering the cold wave that was there in the US just before Christmas, they had temperatures of minus 50 or close to minus 50 degrees Celsius. These are temperatures definitely that I think most batteries are not designed for this. So you shouldn't then not store the battery outside kind of at this temperature. Also, basically the most important point is if you take a very cold battery and use it to discharge it, you really need to make sure that it is warmed up, because if you just put it in ambient temperature and directly use it inside, it's still cold, and it's basically like using it at this very low temperature. Then if you go back from the temperature to the next point, it would be humidity, of course. It's closely connected. Humidity is generally not so good because, like with batteries, you have electricity and humidity is not matching well. Especially if you have very high humidity, you have then cycles, for example. I mean, you test batteries for exposure to high humidity. Therefore, you should not store batteries at high humidity. What can happen is that the humidity creeps into the battery pack, for example. For battery cells, they are typically more tight. It takes more effort that really humidity creeps into the cell, but if you have humidity inside the chemistry, you have a rapid degradation. On battery pack level, humidity is always bad inside a battery pack because you not necessarily can detect it. There are some batteries that have a humidity sensor in the BMS, kind of to see how humid it is inside the battery pack. But if you store it, the battery is switched off. Humidity creeps in. Can happen that mold builds up, and this mold is typically a little bit conductive, so it can lead to higher discharge rate, to some kind of high resistant short circuits, basically. So avoid it. Especially like another thought that I had was also like if you have the batteries, the cells inside the packaging, and you have then humidity inside just a carton box, this is stuck there, and also mold or anything can build up, and in the end you have then a short circuit via this. So the recommendation is definitely use a dry place for storing. Then let's jump to the next big point. That's the state of charge. At which state of charge should you store the battery? There is some temptation to store it at 100% because then often you can use it right after, right? Like you want to have it full later if you use it for the test, for example. So why not store it at 100%? The key reason why to avoid it is really what we discussed in the second episode. The reaction of the battery will be much more severe at very high SOCs compared to very low SOCs. And you store the battery in some remote place, some storage cabinet, for example, in the corner of the room. If anything develops inside the battery, typically it happens unnoticed. There is no constant temperature sensor that checks how warm it is. There is no thermal camera also that goes directly to the battery. The battery is often inside a box, it's shielded away. Maybe you have a camera system for the overall room, but you don't see what's happening to the battery. So if it gets out of control and it is at 100% SOC, the reaction will be much more severe. So go to lower SOCs, ideally, or below 50, definitely, ideally below 30% SOC, but below 50% SOC, you have already a significantly lower reactions happening. Often it's really just like staying inside the battery if something happens, and you do not have a big fire. But again, this is like, don't sue me for this. It can be different from one battery to the next, especially if you go towards prototype stage, those A samples or like really first battery packs. You might not really be aware what will happen. It has not been tried and tested. So here, really be more cautious than just putting it at low SOC and say we'll be all fine. So let's take then the battery out of the storage room and move it to the testing area. What do you need to consider here? When you move the battery, let's split it up into cells and packs. If you move the battery pack, you typically need a forklift because it's so heavy. Be careful because battery packs are very wide, like it's 2.5 meters wide. If you have only 2 forks, it is not very balanced and it should not drop down. Why? Because then you have a shock onto the battery, kind of some mechanical impact, and this will have an effect on the battery. Can have only an effect that some structure inside the battery is deformed, but it can also have an effect on the cell level, that really the layers are moving and they are not fitting each other well afterwards. Also, this is another point. There are these very smart forklift drivers who use the forks to move stuff around, right? Like they just drag it or push it across the floor. You should not do this with a battery, because you put a pointed pressure on some area of the battery, and I would say nobody really knows if this pointed pressure at this point will have an impact. Like, will it go through the case and maybe there's a cell behind that is then impacted. To really understand it, you need to do some very fancy calculations, maybe even simulations, and you can't do this in your head while sitting on the forklift. So do not push the battery around, really just lift it up very carefully. Also, if you lift it up with the forks underneath, you are using the battery basically a little bit different than it's intended, because it's intended to be typically fixed at the frame to the bottom of the car. So the forces go through these fixing points from the battery into the frame of the car. So if you now lift it from the bottom with 2 forks, the force goes through the forks into the center of the battery, and then kind of the frame is pulling the battery down. And this can lead to some deformations inside in the structure, affecting the cells. And this is really key. Like when you have a battery pack, you need to find out how it can be moved safely, because some battery packs need to be moved by a fixture that you have a frame basically that you put on the forks, and on these frames you connect the battery only at these connection points, so that the force is in a similar fashion going through the battery pack as in the real use. Then we talk about the cells. All the cells should not drop to the floor, should not have any major impacts, vibrations. Ideally, you have a cart, you put it on the cart, and then you move it around. There's also something in this area that I want to mention, like from my previous experience doing performance testing, I received once cells, and these were pouch cells, and somebody wrote the numbers on the pouch cells, and he used not a felt tip pen, but like a pointed pen, and because it didn't stick so well on the pouch, he really used some force to draw the numbers. And in the end, basically, you could really feel these ridges of the numbers. And this translates, of course, to all the layers underneath. Like if I'm sure if you open the cell, unfortunately I was not allowed, but if I would have opened the cells, I'm pretty sure that you saw all the numbers on every layer of the cell. Also, a point similar to this is when the cell has a label sticked on it, and then you put compression plates on it, and then suddenly you squeeze the cell at the point where this label is sticked on much more than on the rest of the cell. And this is really a point to kind of avoid, because by this you damage really the layers in the cell. Okay, time is running out, so let's go to one last point, which is, or two last points, which is the smell. If a battery smells, move it away, especially if it has this typical electrolyte smell, like battery cells, battery packs. Make sure it's not used, it's in a safe place with all the safety measures like fire extinguishing and so on. And if the battery is damaged, then also don't use it. I mean, there are different levels of damage. When it has a scratch on the case of a battery pack, it doesn't mean that the whole battery is damaged. But if you have some major damage, do not use the battery anymore. With that, I am way over time. I thank you for listening, and hear you next time at the Battery Testing Mentor podcast.